it's my pleasure to have our guest speaker here, Warren Aston, who we've known for quite some time, Warren, have we not?
We have not. Yes.
And I don't know if any of you are aware of the UFORQ case. Warren was investigating that case. It became quite well known. If you don't know about it, look it up online. It would be simple.
Google. Just Google it. Yep.
UDO, U-D-O, Wartina, W-A-R-T-E-N-A. Yes. Anyway, it's a very good case. But Warren's here to talk to us tonight about someone that some of you will know, which is George Adamski. Now, who knows the George Adamski case? So probably about a third aren't that familiar with it. Okay. So Warren's going to revisit George Adamski and the early contactees, and he's going to do that by the information that is based on his experiences of the last several years in editing the volumes of French researcher and author Michel Zirger. And Michel Zirger, who now lives in Japan, has published 3 books that present a wealth of new, never before published information about George Hunt Williamson and George Adamski. And in particular, his most recent book, Authenticating the George Adamski case, is that the one you've got over here, Warren?
Yes.
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 And there's only probably about 3 copies.
3 copies, yeah.
Shows how computer enhancement of the original photos taken at the Desert Centre contact in November 1952, for those of you who aren't aware of the Dempsey case, shows not only the mothership hovering above the site, as the witness is recorded, but the small bell-shaped craft descending, and later the man called Orthon himself, who was an extraterrestrial, walking towards Demske. So with this information, we need to reassess the information, the case of George Adamski, and Warren's here to do that tonight. Now, Warren's a New Zealand-born Aussie explorer, researcher and author based in Brisbane. And I think you've lived overseas a few times, haven't you? I think so. Getting close to the UFO network in the US. With interests including archaeology, UFOs, world religions, cryptozoology and photography, and he travels widely. So currently he's investigating the unexplained relics in New Caledonia, as reported in Nexus magazine last year. And Warren's lectured on his findings to academic audiences at universities in the US, UK and Australia, and also at many UFO conferences. So would you give him, please, a very warm Australia welcome.
Thank you, first of all, to Cheryl and Lee and everyone else who helped set up these meetings, and especially for those involved in producing the group's newsletter, which is actually, in my unbiased opinion, better than any other publication about UFOs, certainly published here in Australia. And it's better than a lot of the American ones. So please, if you're not familiar with it, subscribe to it. And she didn't pay me to say that. Okay. One other person here tonight who's very important is my technical advisor, and that's Abby. So Abby, would you like to stand up and so everyone can see who's responsible for this? Okay. Perhaps it's different on other planets, but something in our human condition makes us avoid uncomfortable, confronting realities. We avoid thinking about death, for example. Even though we know it's inevitable up here, we know it's inevitable. And yes, it's inevitable sometimes before the rest of the body goes. Many of us struggle to manage life without ever considering how we came to be here. Where did we come from? What's it all about? And scariest of all, what comes next? So almost all of us in our culture have a well-earned PhD in reality avoidance. Not as much as those who still deny the reality of the UFO phenomenon, for example, but most of us still manage to avoid simple truths, even when they are staring us in the face. Unlike many of my fellow ufologists, of course present company excluded, I have never been content with reading reports about lights in the sky, even when they do amazing things, and even reports of craft flying around. After a while, you reach saturation. I mean, how many thousands of good reports from observers like policemen, pilots, astronauts, astronomers, cosmonauts, and so on, do we need before accepting that something not made on Earth is flying around on our planet? How many thousands of photographs and movie films showing these things have to be made before we start taking it seriously? How many more ground traces and metal samples? And if you look into that aspect, a surprising number of physical remains have been found. And much more recently, how many more whistleblowers from the intelligence and military services primarily, but includes astronauts and cosmonauts, need to break their silence before we accept what is happening. Now, there are reasons why the UFO community has not moved forward in some respects, and I want to come to those shortly. Oh, sorry about that last one. I don't know how that popped up. Most of you will recognize this man. That's Philip Corso, Colonel Philip Corso of the US Army. He was a very high-ranking Army colonel, worked in the Pentagon for many years. None of this is disputed, mind you. And I was always perplexed at the muted response from the UFO community, much less the general public, when he told his story in the book that he wrote the day after Roswell, which I'm sure many of you have read. This book tells how at the Pentagon he handled recovered items from the Roswell crash and helped to seed them into various industries so that we could exploit the technology. So here was someone that verifiably did work inside the Pentagon. He saw the bodies from Roswell. This sort of disclosure was what the UFO community prayed for every night, and yet we dithered, we questioned, and we didn't fully embrace what he revealed. Now he's gone, passed away a few years ago. I think the universe saw that we weren't ready for the rest of his story. We didn't deserve it, because he wrote his second book called Dawn of the New Age, which was never published. And if you can get your hands on it, it's an amazing read. It goes way beyond the material in the first one. So when someone says, Warren, one of these craft landed and a person or a being emerged, I obviously, like all of you I'm sure, want to know more. I want to know if what they report is real. Are they delusional? Are they someone who just wants attention? Is it someone who wants fame, money? Is this a prelude to a book or a movie? Were there any other witnesses? Is there any evidence besides the story and so on? The idea of contact with someone or something from another world is just about the most powerful idea that we can imagine. It ties in with our culture and our belief systems in very uncomfortable ways. It's understandable that it has appealed to a whole spectrum of people over the years, ranging from total nut jobs who should be in an asylum to attention seekers, to con men and opportunists. I'm going to name and shame one of them in a minute, right through to people of intelligence and integrity who have simply told what they have experienced and not tried to profit from it and make money from the experience. In some cases, these people had eyewitnesses with them confirming their claim, and in some cases photographs and movie film of the event. So I just want to take you briefly and very quickly through my own journey in ufology, which began with a UFO sighting, although at the time I didn't realize that that's what it had to be. I was, I think it was about 12, and I was with my best friend, and the Americans had just launched a brand new satellite. It was called Echo. Now, some of you who are a certain vintage will remember Echo. Echo was basically a balloon 100 feet in diameter, 30 meters, that was fired into space and inflated and became a big silvery ball that they could shoot radio signals off. Because of the size and because of the silvery color, it was very, very bright. And so they had announced that an Echo, I think they only sent up 2 or 3, but an Echo had just been launched and would be visible over my hometown at such and such a time. And so we got up on top of the hill, because this was back in the early 60s, I guess, and I hadn't planned to speak about it tonight, or I would have been more sure of my facts. But anyway, we were up there with a good view looking out, and sure enough, right on time, this great big bright light came up at the right spot at exactly the right moment and began to go overhead. And of course, back then, everything flying up there was exciting. I can still remember the excitement, not only of the first moon landing, Apollo 11, but I go back right back to 1957 when I was very small, and I can still remember the excitement about Sputnik 1. Anyway, so here's the Echo satellite going up and over, and all of a sudden another light appeared in the same orbit behind it, speeding up. Now, this wasn't as bright, but it sped up until it reached the satellite, and then it did a loop right around it, and then whoosh, much faster than the satellite. And of course, my friend and I, we didn't think UFO, we didn't think aliens or anything like that. We just thought that was cool, that something was flying up there and could do a loop around it. And it wasn't actually until some decades later that I realized that no one on the planet, the Americans, the Russians, even the Chinese, didn't have anything that could do something like that, travel faster than a satellite, do a loop around it, and then fly off. So it had to have been extraterrestrial, or we were both hallucinating. And I can assure you it wasn't the latter. Over the years, I've followed the subject closely, and then once I was living here in Australia, a vital piece of equipment has just fallen down. I don't know what it does. It looks like a mouse. Oh, thank you. I might need that. My first field research began years ago after I read a third-hand account of a 1940 alien encounter by a man named Udo Wartener, and that's who Cheryl alluded to earlier. That's a photo of him taken at about the same time, maybe just after the event. Now, he had actually died before I'd managed to go over, but he had an account of an encounter while he was working in a shaft under the ground at a gold mine. And it happened in daytime, and he was digging the shaft, and he heard a humming sound. It came up. Has anyone here heard the story? Okay. he heard this humming sound. This is 1940, so it's before anyone went into space, even before any satellites, even before Roswell. But he heard this humming sound and climbed up, and here is a large, what he thought was a blimp, a balloon. It was about 100 feet across, and it was just hovering there off the ground, and a door opened up underneath, and a man came out of it and walked over to him and apologized and said that they didn't know anyone was in the area, which I thought was nice compared to some of the encounters people have had over the years. But they wanted to take water from the stream where he was working. And so he said he couldn't think of a reason why not. And so this great big tube thing came out and started sucking up water. And he spent about 2 hours with them. There was another man there as well, talking to them, answering, asking them questions. They were happy to answer any question, but they said they would not talk about religion or God or their beliefs. And they said, we cannot interfere in any way. And one of the things that interested me most was that in the course of their conversations, they said that they live among us from time to monitor our progress and our lack of progress. They asked him if he would like to go aboard and have a look around, and they explained everything. And some of this stuff is the first time anyone has reported what is now very common in ufology. Anyway, after 2 hours, they had sucked up a large quantity of water, and they explained what the water is for, and shook hands and left. So I went over to Oregon, which is where he had ended up in his life, and I went over there twice and was able to interview his best friend, to whom he first told what had happened. I was able to track down his own handwritten account of the whole event. A very conservative, substantial family. His son, for example, today is a pilot with Delta. I met one of his daughters. I met other people who had known him and could not speak more highly of his integrity. So not one of them had any doubt that it had happened. If he said it happened, it happened. And it's now regarded as one of the most credible and significant pre-Roswell cases of alien contact. I repeated this again with a man named Leo Dworshak. Now, he lived in the same general area as the northwest of the US, and his experiences began even earlier. They began in 1932. Anyway, Leo and his younger brother were just children when they first encountered a very large object and began seeing it land near their farm on a regular basis. And eventually, after I think it was about 2 years of watching this happen and getting closer and closer to it, they met the men who came out of it and talked to them. And their association with this group of people continued over the years. They were allowed to go on board, and eventually, towards the end of his life, Leo wrote a book about it. And so I thought, I need to go and talk to this man. Unfortunately, he died also just 2 weeks before I got there. But again, like Udo, Leo was regarded as having outstanding integrity. Unlike Udo, his contacts and he and his brother's contacts continued for more than 30 years, and it's all in his book, which is called UFOs Are Real. You can take my word, and you can buy that through Amazon. So I went to Montana. He had died, but I was able to meet his daughter and people he knew and visit the areas. And so, again, I was left with no doubt whatsoever that this experience had happened. My next major research effort was a very different situation. It began in 1956, the Amicizia case. Any Italian speakers here? Tino, where are you? Close enough?
Yeah, very good, very good. 8 out of 10.
8 out of 10. All right. Do you want to give us a 10 out of 10?
Yeah, you got a 10 out of 10.
No.
Amicizia.
Amicizia. Okay, which means friendship.
Amicizia, yes.
Okay. This is, I actually gave a talk here some years ago about it. There's a documentary on it and we showed the film. But this is, to date, the largest and longest running case of alien contact ever. And it was centered in Europe, but particularly in Italy. Now, a professor in Italy, Stefano Breccia, first broke the story and made it go public with a book that he wrote, and that's him there. He was a computer scientist who did a lot of work in universities. And he began to tell the story. More than 200 people were involved in the case, and they ranged from housewives right through to theologians, politicians. There was a diplomat, people of very, very high standing, but a whole range of people across the community, and not just in Italy. This went on in a number of the other European countries. Now, his first book, English wasn't his first language, and the first book was a bit of a shocker as far as editing goes. So I was in email contact with him, and he had another book ready to go, which was basically an updated and expanded version, and I offered to edit it for him simply because I believed in the importance of the book. And eventually that came out, and that's the story there. 50 years was the anniversary. And what's interesting about this case is that it's still going on today. Unfortunately, though, Stefano Breccia died also before we ever got to meet. So if I call you and say I want to come and interview you, you have some good reasons to be hezidant. I'm now deeply involved in the investigation of a Brazilian case that some of you may have heard of, but it's not very well known, and it involves a man who was accidentally taken back to the planet of an alien team that was taking vegetation samples. He awoke on their world, and it took him some time to accept that he was no longer on Earth. So he spent 8 days there, learning a great deal about the people, their beliefs, their history, before they brought him back to Earth. And when he got back, he recovered and wrote 400 longhand pages of what he had experienced. Very, very detailed. Now, he has also died quite some time ago, and I haven't yet gone over to Brazil to follow that up, but I am in touch with his daughter, his son, and a grandson, and the grandson speaks quite good English. So stay tuned. But now, more relevant for tonight, enter Michel Zirger in Tokyo. Now, Michel, that's him there, is French, born and raised in France, but now lives in Japan and is married to a Japanese lady. His mother first saw a craft from their apartment, very close up and over quite a number of minutes. And then a similar thing happened. He was needing some help because, again, his language is not English. His English is quite good, but I again offered to edit his first book. And that was this book here, The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson. Now, anyone who's been in the UFO field for any period of time knows that name, but no one knows very much about him. I would strongly recommend it. It's beautifully written. It's brilliantly edited, of course. But this is the first biography of George Hunt Williamson. And why he's important is because he was one of the witnesses at the beginning of the George Adamski case, which I'm going to come to in a minute or two. But he then went off on his own path, which was a more mystical variety. And that's a photo of him there. It's not a particularly glamorous photo, but it was taken while he was living in Peru. And he wrote a number of books that are, even today, hugely influential in ufology. So if you're interested in that, you'll enjoy that book, The Incredible Life. I gave it the subtitle, Mystical Journey. Okay, so George Hunt Williamson travelled a different road, but he confirmed that, yes, along with 5 other witnesses, he clearly saw a strangely dressed man talking with George Adamski in the desert. Now, he was an anthropologist, and when he says he saw the mothership, he saw the smaller craft flying around, and he saw this man talking with Adamski, that gets my attention. Now, I want to use this as a focus for my presentation tonight. It comes from Michel Zirger's book, and I want to read it to you, and so you can read it yourself, but I want to read it to you to help you get the importance of what he's saying, because I think it's very, very significant. For the last 50 years, we've been led by the nose, and he's talking here to ufologists, so anyone who's interested in UFOs. Led by the nose by a small clique of astronomer, statistician, ufologists, allegedly rigorous, who have led ufology down a blind alley to where it is at present. All have in common that they rejected in one way or another the contactees. Now, some of you will read that and instinctively think of a specific person that he's referring to. But he's not referring just to one person, he's referring to a number. Sorry. I don't know how those pictures got up there. I chose that quote because it, to me, perfectly encapsulates what has happened within mainstream ufology over the last half century. In his books, Zirger doesn't hesitate to name names, explain motives, and show how and why ufology has arrived on its present plateau. Now, I have to say here, to be honest, there are some encouraging signs over the last year or two. Ufology, I think, is starting to realize these things for themselves, but we still got a long way to go to get back on track. So when it comes to contactees, that's those people who claim to have met someone from another world. I began to experience firsthand the biases that were guiding some of the largest research groups. And I won't name them, but one of them starts with M. and ends with N. But they would not entertain the contactees. So Cheryl said roughly a third of you here weren't very familiar with the name of George Adamski. George Adamski was not the first person to claim to have met someone from another world, but he was the first person to receive worldwide attention for his claims. And it went on for a long time. So even though he's dead, and I didn't try to interview him, but even though he's gone now, his books are still widely read and still in print. And yet he's been rejected wholesale by most people in ufology, and that included myself, because I believed that these leading lights, and yes, one of them's Dr. Jacques Vallée, who's a French astronomer, statistician, and UFO researcher. He's still alive, but I have no interest in interviewing him.
Are you worried about
no, I'm not worried about what would happen to him, but I accepted what they were saying, and I too rejected Adamski. I rejected the other contactees that arose at about the same time. Sorry, I'm getting carried away here with this clicking. And then I began to watch a period that many of you would have seen, where the phenomenon of abductions in particular began to almost abduct ufology. So here's my take on the whole abduction phenomenon. Do they take place? Yes. Are some of the greys, as we call them, actually aliens? Some, yes. But most are androids built by aliens, and that explains a lot of the characteristics that are universally reported. And some of the abductions, I think it's quite clear now, are staged events by humans to generate a new narrative and divert ufology and the public away from the great reality. And still others have helped to divert ufology from where it should be. Now I'm going to quote myself. I wrote in something recently, along with many other researchers, I found, for example, that the stories from one of the most quoted figures in the field, Whitley Strieber, were merely opportune science fiction that has contributed to the move away from science fact. Now, there's quite a story to this. This is the first book, and this is the book that got Strieber a lot of publicity and a lot of attention. When he was preparing the book for publication, the artist who prepared the illustration of what he claimed he had met and who lived in his bedroom in his house for several days, all kinds of things, the head actually was flat and went right across the top of the eyes. And many of you will also know the name of Bud Hopkins, who was an American gentleman who led the way in using hypnotic regression. Some of you would have met him. He's passed away as well. A lot of people passed away. It's just...
I'm getting worried.
Stay to the end of the meeting with us, Colin. But he was being regressed and talking with Bud Hopkins, and Bud Hopkins looked at this image of a grey and he said, "Whitley, you know that a creature looking like that has never been reported by anyone else." He said, "The head is always much higher." And Strieber said something to the effect, "Ah, yes, now that I come to think of it, it was more circular, and so it ended up looking like that." Anyway, He's been caught out in many lies, and I don't have any concerns about saying that to you tonight. When we brought him here to Brisbane years ago, a whole room full of people heard his wife Anne admit that he just makes it all up, and that's a direct, accurate quote. Bud Hopkins confirmed to me in writing, and I have a copy of the email here if anyone's concerned, interested enough in looking at it, a copy of the email. Let me just read a couple of lines off it. Dear Warren, okay, Strieber is unable to tell fantasy from reality. Virtually nothing he claims should be accepted as true, and most researchers have long been aware of this fact. Strieber is bad news for serious research, the ultimate loose cannon, and personally is a profoundly unhappy, emotionally confused individual. And that's from Bud Hopkins, who unfortunately also has departed from the scene. But the reason I picked this up is I continue to find, I read an awful lot, and probably an unhealthy amount, but I read a lot, and I still see Strieber, Whitley Strieber, or some of his ideas quoted as being some sort of fact, as something offering insight. Now, he's a brilliant science fiction writer. I'll give him that. If you want to read his books as science fiction, go for it. They're great, but do not accept them as fact. He's been caught out so often on saying things that, yes. Anyway, the trouble is he's not alone. Now, ufology is an unregulated field, and that means that oxygen is sometimes given to increasingly bizarre claims presented without any evidence, and they continue to proliferate. We can listen to outrageous claims from people, and I could throw in a few more names here, but I won't, who provide zero support, including zero logic, for their flights of fantasy. I was on Neptune last week and I saw this and I met this, and then we went to Ganymede, and you know, this sort of thing goes on even today, and in fact it seems to be increasing. And because of these charlatans in ufology, or just on the borderline of ufology, diverting our attention from what's really going on. So it's no wonder that ufology as a field, except for UFO Research Queensland, thanks to Cheryl, ufology as a field has generally largely failed to attract the scientific community or provoke the media to break from its constraints to cover what is surely the story of the millennium. Are there fraudulent cases and claims? Many. One I have to mention is UMO, UMMO, if any of you have heard of that. We now know who was behind that and the motivation for it. But again, we still see this quoted as an example of another civilization. So let's come back to what I would say is reality. George Adamski. George Adamski is a very unique person in practically every way. I'm sorry I never got to see him or meet him. He died in 65, I think, somewhere around there, but he had converted a small telescope to have a camera attached to it, and had some success in photographing UFOs in the sky. This is in California. And in November 1952, he basically had a hunch that they should go, he and some of his friends should go out into the desert. Now, for those of you who have been to Los Angeles, you know that once you sort of drive east, you're very soon in desert and mountains. And they met together and went to a particular place. Now, late morning they stopped to have a snack. It was like a morning tea. And all of a sudden an aircraft flew over. It was a commercial flight and they'd been able to track down where it was going. But that made them look up into the sky, and when they did, it was a beautiful clear day. This is around lunchtime, middle of the day. They saw a very large cigar-shaped ship hanging in the sky above them. And so I guess they probably got quite excited at that point. But although they tried to photograph it, it was too far away, and with the cameras available back then, it was just a little patch of light and didn't register on a bright sky. Anyway, to cut the story short, and this will be familiar to most of you, I would think, they then separated. Adamski asked to be driven back a little ways and onto a level area that they had passed, and there he set up his telescope with the camera on it to be ready in case, you know, they could see something more and something closer. The others stood nearby, now somewhere between 1.5 and 2 kilometers away, but you know, still very clear, and it was perfect weather. They could see everything happening. Then they saw a flash, you know, a reflected light in the sky, and immediately saw a small craft descending. So Adamski immediately sighted through his telescope and began snapping photos. Now, back then, of course, in that pre-digital age, he was using a camera that used photographic plates that had to be loaded with film and then inserted and removed. And he had time to snap 7 shots before, and then he was out of film. But he was so fast, and the craft was coming down so quickly, that he didn't take the time to focus properly on it, which again was a slow process. You had to focus on the screen. And the craft drifted to a stop, and it was about 1/2 mile from him and remained just above the ground, but it went down just behind a small hill, and only the top was now visible. So with the 7 plates now exposed and safely in his jacket pocket, he began taking photographs with his second camera, which was the old Box Brownie, and some of you might remember them. They're actually quite a good camera. They had a surprisingly good lens for the period. And so his first impulse naturally was to photograph the craft, which was now barely visible behind the hill. It then moved again until it was completely out of view. So he took 2 more photos to record the general setting. And then a short time later, he suddenly noticed someone in the distance standing and motioning for him to approach. Orthon had arrived. Now, the story of their meeting, their conversation for about 45 minutes, and the strange footprints left behind, all of it witnessed by his companions, is too well known to warrant repeating here. But I want to jump ahead now to something that transpired a little bit later that day. After Orthon, the man, which incidentally was the name given to him by Adamski's ghostwriter later on, but it had a significance. The group spent several hours making plaster of Paris casts of the footprints and the symbols they contained. And they didn't leave the site until these had safely dried. And then the story related by Dempsey was George, and that's George Hunt Williamson, and Al Bailey asked permission to give a report to an Arizona paper, and I granted it. They decided to drive to Phoenix, since that was the closest large city whose papers would have the best coverage. They asked me a number of questions to help them in their report, one of which was how large was the saucer, which they had seen but not as close up. Dempsey got up within touching distance. I answered about 20 feet, but I was still in a daze and did not actually recall noticing how large it really was. I had noticed the details and not the overall. But to substantiate their report, I gave them a couple of the film holders with exposed film for the newspaper to finish and use if they desired. And so later that afternoon, after having dinner together, the Williamsons, that's George Hunt Williamson and his wife, and the two Baileys, drove off to Phoenix and met with reporters from the Phoenix Gazette newspaper, which was the largest area newspaper. The paper took a photograph of its own showing the two couples looking at the negatives, and then proceeded to go ahead and develop them themselves. Now, at first, of course, the story was treated with incredulity and resulted in an invitation from the two couples for the reporters to go and visit the site and see the footprints for themselves, which they could have done. They didn't, but it was still a spectacular story and guaranteed to sell papers. And so an article written by one of their reporters appeared in the Gazette a couple of days later. It had a light-hearted introduction, but the article was actually quite a good summary of the events and had only minor errors. And here the story takes us into a strange collision of worlds, because the Gazette developed the two exposed film holders themselves. Now, Adamski didn't know whether anything was on the plates. This is the area where the encounter actually took place. It's become a site that some people like to go and visit. It's near a small town called Desert Center, and that's a group of people there visiting the area, but still very remote. Now, that's the front page of the Phoenix Gazette, November the 24th, 1952. And there's the photo. Flying saucer passenger declares A-bomb blast, reason for visits. Okay, now I had seen this photo, and I suppose many of you had too, and certainly hundreds of thousands of people saw it. That's a close-up of it. Now, it's a little blurry, but even today, in 2019, that's a pretty good shot of a UFO. Now, it's exactly what the people had seen, what Adamski himself described, and it's what the other people witnessed as well. You can see the angle that he's taken it, looking up. You can see the clouds in the bottom there. And actually, if you look very closely, you can make out the three spheres on the bottom of it. Now, and the windows on the top, you can see at least two of them, maybe three. What almost everyone overlooked then and right until the present is the very simple fact that this image actually supports Adamski's account. It's a close-up daytime photo, shows a well-defined structured craft at an oblique angle above the camera. The perspective looks like it's consistent with something in descent mode. You can see the landing gear. It's slightly unfocused, but that's exactly what Adamski said, that he didn't have time to, he didn't take the time because he would have missed the shot. How do we account for this photo? Given that we know Adamski didn't process the photo or any of his friends, it was independently processed and developed. people have ignored the significance. Dempsey himself didn't see this photo until it appeared on the newspaper front page, so there was no chance of him pulling off some kind of manipulation during the development, even if it was possible back then. So despite staring the UFO community and the skeptics in the face, this image has been ignored, even by the few commentators who have attempted to deal with the first contactee. And this gets back to my opening remarks about how we have trouble facing reality. So we now need to reevaluate Adamski's claims and those of the early contactees who arose at the same time. This photo was made in front of witnesses. It was independently developed, and it shows a flying saucer. That's not a cloud, it's not a bird, certainly not Venus. And that requires us to reconsider the claims of Adamski. So when I realized this a few years ago, it marked a turning point in my conversion, because along with most people, I had rejected Adamski's claims as ludicrous and even laughable, and like the majority of ufologists, I regarded Adamski and his fellows as largely self-deluded and frauds. I read their books, but with some disdain, and along with most other researchers and writers, I failed to investigate their claims for myself. I was wrong, and I'm happy to admit that now. All right, what's happened to it? There we go. So again, we come back to Michel Zirger's quote. We've been led by this group of astronomers, statistician, ufologists, who have led ufology down a blind alley, and they all have something in common. They rejected the contactees. So I began to edit Michel Zirger's second book, which is We Are Here. And this is taken from an experience that he had himself in Tokyo, where he encountered with witnesses on 2 occasions someone who was clearly from another world. It's a book, I believe, destined to become a classic, and it's one I believe is already beginning to reshape ufology. And that's the book there. You can buy it through Amazon. Someone here showed me their own copy of it earlier this evening, so I'm glad to know that it's getting out there. So please, if you like getting into this stuff and you want to get away from the same old repetitive stuff that you read so much of and read original, verifiable material, this is a good one. And that's on one of the occasions in Tokyo, he had a professional artist draw the face of the man. September last year, there were 2 major developments that were totally unexpected by myself, and they arrived on top of each other. Now, many of you here, I would hope the majority, would be familiar with Nexus magazine. It sounds like I'm just here tonight to sell books and magazines.
We better read the obits next week.
Anyway, Nexus magazine carried an article about the Aztec, New Mexico crash. Now, this is a crash of a UFO about 9 months after Roswell, so it was in 1948. Yes. And a new document had surfaced, and in it, it was released by a couple of intelligence agents who wanted to get the story out there. They were elderly, and it claimed to be a copy of a briefing document from the Defence Intelligence Agency. Now, in there, which the crash itself is not new, we've known about it for yonks, but this now claimed that there were in fact four survivors of the crash, and two of them were adults and one of them was revived and was interviewed over a long period of time before he returned to his people. And so this was all very interesting. But as I read through it, I read this interview where the alien man, who looked very much like us and spoke English, said that there was still proof, evidence here on the earth for the activities of his people going back here for thousands of years. And he mentioned that some of this was to be found on an island called the Isle of Pines. And of course, I'm thinking, Isle of Pines, okay. I've been to New Caledonia. I could only find, it's funny, the issue had come up a couple of years earlier, and I could only find one UFO/alien report from the whole country. But anyway, he went on to say that there was evidence there of a concrete landing platform from about 11,500 years ago. And so I thought, what? Why haven't I heard of this? You know, and so I started digging and researching. And what I found was that there is actually an archaeological mystery on the Isle of Pines that I'd never heard of before. I began going over to the Isle of Pines in New Caledonia and researching it, and found that there's over 400 of these structures made of concrete. Now, that's a local man who's helping me. They have a hollow shaft going through them from top to bottom, which is circular, very smooth, and have been dated, carbon dated, from shells that were found in the concrete to anywhere from 9,000 to 12,000 years ago. So they fall within that range. So that's an ongoing thing. We're not done yet, but I was over there in November with 3 archaeologists, one from Canberra, from ANU, and 2 French archaeologists from New Caledonia. One of them's the head of the archaeological work for the whole country. And while they were aware of them, no one within the archaeological community that specialises in the South Pacific. So I guess that's not too many people. They don't see any particular excitement when they talk about them, but some of the ideas that they've come up with to explain them have just been truly laughable. I won't spend time on that. What was that?
Swamp gas?
No, not quite that laughable, but yeah, they just don't see. And so when I say to them, well, look, the technology to make concrete is only just over 2,000 years old, and in this part of the world, it's only about 200 years old. Not even that. It didn't come until the arrival of the Europeans. So, you know, what they are, what they were for, why does it have a tunnel going through the middle of it, exactly in the centre? One of them was excavated by a French archaeologist back in the 60s, and underneath there's a cone-shaped object made of iron, and that's the focus now, to try and recover one of these and go from there. So anyway, this all happened and this was all very fascinating. But then I got an email from Michel Zirger, who I was then working on his second book. He had been contacted by a fellow in Copenhagen, Rene Olsen. Now, Rene is a photographer, an artist, a fairly interesting fellow. He had been fascinated by UFOs for a long time, and so he got this idea that he would start to get some of the old photos from the Demske period and the Demske contact and colorize them. So that's the result of one of them. Now, some of you will have seen this as a black and white photo. That's taken after the contact that I talked about earlier with the Dempsey. That's George Hunt Williamson there on the right, making plaster of Paris casts of the footprints. And it's some other members of the group. So it does make it nice to see, you know, the colours restored to a photo.
That's a pretty rough sort of surface there to get a nice footprint in that.
Yeah, well, yeah, read the book. Yeah, no, it's a good point, but actually the soil there is remarkable, remarkably suitable for what happened. Then Renee got the idea, and this was early last year, and of course no one really knew about it. Renee got the idea of going back and taking scans of the original negatives of the UFO, of the craft coming down, and see if, you know, that made them any easier to understand. And it's an understatement to say that what emerged using ordinary 21st century Photoshop computer technology was far beyond his expectations, because parts of the image have been revealed that no one has seen since they were taken in 1952. So here's an example. Original photo up there, and that's already been cleaned up a little bit, but there it is, and enhanced and colorized. Now, he's not manipulating any pic source, okay? If anyone's interested, you can look into this and get some of the technical details. All he does is remove the noise, the spots, the artifacts, distortions and that. The original image is there. Okay, I would like to show you a lot more, but I'm not allowed to show the really good ones. Yeah, they're in the book. Okay, so then Michel emailed me because it turned out that one of the photos actually shows Orthon. And this, to me, when I first read it, it seemed too fantastic. But the image is there. And I guess what's significant to me is the fact that we can't doubt its authenticity. It's a photo that's been around for decades in public view, and it was made long before any digital manipulation became possible. All he's done is scan it, clean it up, and at a higher resolution, and we see details. And it's now clear that Adamski himself would not have been aware, probably, of what he had captured. So, I'll come back to these photos in a minute, but I want to just focus for a minute now on Adamski's other photos and movies, and show you just very quickly some of them, just to remind you of what he has taken, had taken over the years. And just bear in mind, not one of them has ever been disproved or found to be a fake. Okay, this is one of his early shots. It's a photo through the telescope of the moon and a whole fleet of objects passing in front of the moon. And there's a better, clearer shot, and that shows a craft. And I don't know what these are up in the top right. No one comments on them. Here's another object of another photo of a whole flotilla of objects. And that's in front of the sun. And that's something that might be a bit familiar to you. They estimated this was very large, and it was about 30 miles distance, taken early in the morning. And then, if you've ever heard of Adamski, you've surely seen these photos. It's where one of these cigar-shaped objects, the mother craft, obviously, is releasing the smaller objects. And more of them emerge. I'll just go back to that. Apparently, these have still not been enhanced, incidentally, but apparently when they are, we'll be able to see, it won't be a smudge of light like that, we'll be able to see the object sharp because of the contrast. That's the way they've been reproduced. And then, of course, the most famous, taken through the telescope. Adamski also had a number of movies. One was taken in Mexico, which I haven't yet been able to track down. But this is the one not long before he died. It was taken in Silver Springs, Maryland, where a craft came down, and with a witness with him, they were able to film this. And this is a still shot from the movie film, and you can see the distortion of the bottom of the craft there, and the balls, the three balls moving. So it's quite interesting. There's a lot of stuff about Adamski that we're not sure of. Some of them are speculative. For example, the uncle that watched over him since childhood when he and his parents came over from Poland by ship to the US. Interesting to think about who that person might have been and the role he may have played. But one thing that is certain is Desmond Leslie, who's actually a cousin of Winston Churchill, that's him there with Adamski when he went over to California to visit him. And it was actually, the main part of the book was actually written by Desmond Leslie, Lord Desmond Leslie. And then he heard about Adamski's experience, contacted Adamski by snail mail, and Adamski sent him copies of all of his photos, and then they added his account to the book, and that's the book there. Flying Saucers Have Landed, a real classic. Desmond Leslie revealed that Adamski had a very large, very deep sunstone birthmark on his navel. He didn't have a navel as such, like most of us here do, but he has a very large incised birthmark on his navel in the shape of a sunstone. But there's a lot of other interesting stuff. Someday, I hope someone will try and do a biography of Adamski. It's never been done. His marriage, for example, to Mary Shimbursky, how many of us knew that she believed that she came from Venus in a previous life? How many of us know that Desmond Leslie himself saw craft and monitoring probes while he lived at Mount Palomar? How many of us know that Desmond Leslie also saw an alien man who was meeting Adamski in a train in London? Some of us will know about Lou Zinstag, a lady, a Swiss lady. She was actually a cousin of Sigmund Freud, but don't hold that against her. But she was a first-hand witness to the fact that young men were visiting Adamski at his hotel in Europe, and she got to see one of them at least close up. And she later had an encounter with two of them. And closer to home, I have a friend in New Zealand called Tony Brunt. I don't know, has anyone heard of Tony? Okay, I'll come back to him in a minute, but he was involved when Adamski came and did his tour of New Zealand and Australia back in 1960 something. 59? 59, thanks Colin. And there was a mysterious young man that nobody could put a finger on or put a name to, accompanying him and watching him. And when he got here to Australia, there was a mystery woman involved. So I don't know if anyone knows about that, but she was quite a stunning lady, and everyone came to feel that she was there to keep an eye on things as well. Most of us know that the names given to Adamski's aliens were invented later by his ghostwriter, Charlotte Blodgett. But does anyone know that Adamski told several of his closest associates, including Carol Honey, if anyone knows the name, that Venus, Mars, and Saturn were not their real origin planets? Okay, what I'd like to do now is take a giant leap of faith and just to give you a feeling for Adamski, the man, play a little sound recording.
Richard Burwood put to him the questions you and I want to ask.
Thanks.
Welcome to London, Mr. Dempsey.
I'm mighty glad to be here. A little chilly to what I have been accustomed to.
It has gone to the cold, and never mind, it'll warm up perhaps tomorrow. Now, you've just phoned in from Australia as part of your world tour lecturing on flying saucers. You claim to have spoken to people from Venus, and your recent book, Inside the Spaceships, you say you've made a journey. Now, are these facts correct?
They are correct. They're facts, and they'll stand as facts for a long time, I believe.
There are very many people believe in the existence of flying saucers, but few, if any, have had the experiences that you've had. Now, can you tell me, where did you first meet a man?
Well, out in the desert, Mojave Desert, 1952, on November the 28th.
And you've met him since?
I've met him since, and I'll go a little further. I've also flown around the moon.
Have you really?
Yes.
Have you really?
There we go.
Thank you. Yes, it is funny in a way. Anyway, Dempsey was a character, certainly a very individual type of person. And you know what? Even aliens came to hear him when he spoke. This was taken at one of Adamski's public speaking engagements in California. They had a big open air seating, and around 100 to 150 people would come for a 2-day conference. And on this one occasion, there was a small group of 3 people. And this lady is tiny. She's apparently well under 5 foot tall, and claimed that her name was Dolores. And a photographer was able to snap 2 photos of her because she and her 2 male companions were drawing attention just simply by the way they looked. And I don't know about you, but you know, she's definitely quite odd looking with those eyes. Now, Adamski had flaws. No one's going to pretend otherwise. He had flaws, like all of us, and my friend Tony Brunt in New Zealand has written the closest thing to what is a real warts and all biography of him. It addresses the claims that we've all found ridiculous, and does a good job in presenting a balanced view. So, time for a photo of Tony. I don't know if any of you know Tony. He's been a newspaper reporter and a journalist for most of his life. I met with him in Auckland a couple of years ago. Really nice guy. And as I say, what's important about this is the fact that he has written a short biography, George Adamski, the toughest job in the world. And you'll find that Tony doesn't beat around the bush. Your eyes will bulge in a few places, but in the end he ultimately concludes that he was real and that his initial experiences especially were true. Now, just to go back now to Michel Zirger, he has just released a new book which is called Authenticating the George Adamski Case. Now, this is just out. I got some copies sent down, and I think there's only seriously only one left? Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, I'm not here to sell books. Well, I am actually, but if anyone's interested, there's one copy, and this has a sample of the photos that have been enhanced, including the photo of Orthon. So you can see it for yourself. You can now buy it. It's just gone on sale on Amazon. I think it's, because it's a full color book, it's around about $50, $51. I'm not sure from memory if it's available as an ebook. I think it is. Anyway, there is one hard copy left there for $39. So, what does it all mean? Just to remind you, what is the reality, the simple truth about UFOs and aliens? And I want to share with you now what I have concluded up to this stage in my life. I hope and I believe that most of you will feel the same way about these things. Firstly, we here on Earth have never been alone. The speed of light is no more a barrier than the speed of sound was, and the speed of a steam train before that. Earth has always been watched over and helped by the people of other worlds, as Professor Herman Oberth, the father of space travel, called them when explaining some of our leaps forward in space travel. The human form is universal. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more in a minute. We are connected to them. Some of them are our ancestors. Their influence on humanity throughout history has been profound and deeper than any of us realize, even those of us here in this room. Some of them live among us right now. Some of us have met them and visited their worlds. All along, our visitors have nudged us forward towards a better future without direct interference. We live in the first world, and this is foreign to us, but this is the reality for millions and millions of people on this planet. It's probably the most heartbreaking photo I've seen in years. Rejected by his family because they thought he was a witch, and they found him, he was only about 2. Poverty, hunger, and inequality, the inequality of wealth on this planet will end as soon as the cover-up does, and the elites are forced to release the advanced technology they have hidden from us for the last 60 or more years. That's got to be something that we should be looking forward to. Now I want to show you some pictures, and these are people from other worlds. And from now on, I don't want to call them aliens. I want to call them people from other planets. He's over 8 foot tall. They've done the work on that. That's his face. Some of you might have seen that one before. Maria, she went by the name then of Maria Orsich. Still around. Okay, the 3 people there, the fellow and the closest to the camera, the one next to him, and the blonde lady next to him. This is a photo very few people have had. It's a meeting in 1958 at the home of Howard Menger, who was a fellow contactee. Now, what do you notice about all of these pictures? Does anyone see an intelligent amoeba floating in the air, waving at us, or a stick insect standing on its hind legs talking about relativity? In all of these photos, and all of the cases I've talked about, they are humanoid. They have 2 arms, 2 legs, a trunk, 2 eyes. Everything's in the right place. They're variations of the universal human form. Now, there probably are others among them who are reptilians, but my point here is that the majority of intelligent species are humanoid, and this is one of the great realities that we have to accept. Now, please don't come up to me afterwards and say, but Warren, you don't understand. I saw this creature, and it was pure evil. It had wrinkled skin, smelt bad too. Yes, such beings exist. I know they do. I even married one once. But still, no. But still, they are the exceptions that prove the general rule. Yes, I don't rule out anything, but my point is tonight that the majority, overwhelming majority of verifiable cases are dealing with people who are basically variations, and the difference between them and us is not more than the differences between ourselves. Now, I see people here tonight, different skin colors, different heights, different hair colors, sometimes no hair at all. You know, we are different, but we're still human, and so are they. So a final message, let's not suspend everything in our lives while we await disclosure. Because in fact, disclosure has been happening all along. It's been a leaky disclosure to help acculturate us and get us prepared. It will come eventually for the general public, and there's been some amazing things happening in the last 18 months or so, which some of you will be aware of. I mean, the Pentagon, head of the Pentagon UFO program comes out and says they're real. I mean, what, you know, some people are saying it's already happened, we blinked. But as individuals, we don't have to wait for that. We can achieve disclosure ourselves right now and move beyond it. We already have all the tools to do that. And that will bring us to the point where we're ready. As Colonel Corso tried to tell us from his first-hand experience behind the scenes, the simple truth is that we are literally at the birth of a new age. It's time for us to leave the illusion of the 3D matrix and all its falsehoods to emerge into the wider universe. Thank you.